In this presentation, I provide a very basic introduction to cultural and social change. Obviously, cultures change. If we think of the city of London, once there were Stone Age hunter-gatherers living there, then there were people who used bronze living there, then there were people who used iron living there, then there were Romans who lived with slaves there, then there was, of course, Vikings, then Saxons, that became an industrial city, then it became a sort of post-industrial city as it is right now. So obviously, you just take one city, you can see an enormous amount of change. But even at a smaller level, if you think about the life your grandparents led, and your own life, you'll probably find it's very different. So the question is, how can we explain this change? Explain the change between London from its human beginnings till now, or the difference between your grandparents' life and your own life. Now, I'm going to take an anthropological approach to this, and anthropology is typically said to be very bad at explaining cultural change. The reason given for that defamation against anthropology's character is that we go to a culture, allegedly, and just take a snapshot of what a village or a city or a small group looked like at one point in history. And unlike a movie which shows change and is dynamic, we just get one single image. But I think this is a superficial analysis, and that anthropology will prove to be no better or worse than other disciplines at explaining cultural change, because we basically rely on the same models. Well, what are those models? The first model I want to discuss is the model of advancement. The idea is that through history, cultures and societies progress, improve, and develop. This is a very common idea, and there are many, many examples. One famous example is the history of the Whigs, or if you like, the liberals of English history. And the Whigs saw the history of England. Famously, Macaulay looked at the history from the accession of King to the 1800s, to Queen Victoria's reign, as a period of improvement, a period of increasing democracy and liberalism, triumphing over monarchy and conservatism. A more famous and more widely used model is the Marxist historical model, I should say, which is sometimes called the dialectic. There are technical terms like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and it's something like this. We all started off living in a perfect world, or communal world, of each according to his needs and to each according to his ability, a kind of hunter-gathering, happy lifestyle. And then we broke up into having free men and slaves. There was a revolution, which landed us with aristocracy and villeins or serfs or peasants. There was another revolution which led to bourgeoisie, that's the sort of factory owners and plantation owners, and proletariat, that is people working class. And there's another revolution, and that leads to socialism and eventually to communism. So this, that's the Marxist model. There's also a kind of what we call an Enlightenment model, which is closely related to the Whiggish model, which sees modern European history as a triumph of reason over superstition, of science over magic and religion. Now, these ideas have been critiqued. This idea of history's progress has been critiqued. Normally, the term we use for it in anthropology is teleology. That's Teleology. And what that means, it's a term coming from Aristotle, actually, from Greek philosophy, meaning things evolve in a definite direction towards a goal, towards perfection. So you get an acorn, an oak tree seed, and you plant it. Its goal, or the thing it heads towards, is an oak tree. So from acorn to oak tree, from superstition to enlightenment, from religion to reason, from free men and slaves to communism, and from monarchy and conservatism to democracy and liberalism. And so this teleology is typically seen as a kind of triumphant march of progress. And anthropologists are very uncomfortable with this idea. It's seen, we could call it in a postmodern term, as a kind of grand narrative. A way of structuring history, or a way of structuring our sense of the past, which really doesn't account for the past accurately. For example, if we use this model, we see like Australian society, which I live in, as more advanced than, for example, society in, well, recently South Africa was critiqued by one of our ministers as being less civilised, that is backward. So there's this idea of, this teleological idea is often racist. It doesn't really match up with academic understandings of the world, how we understand the world as anthropologists. We don't see certain societies being left behind. We see all societies interacting and adjusting in their own way, in their own specific way. And you know, you might think to yourself, oh, I never believed in that triumphant march of progress. But there are a lot of people who, for example, when you talk about human rights, people who think that in terms of human rights, they'll say, oh, Sweden's so advanced, whereas Eastern Europe is so backward, or something like that. The presumption is that there's this march of progress where Sweden is further advanced than other places. Or we'll talk about the medicine of our great-grandparents' time being so backward and our medicine as being so great, and we wonder how great medicine will be in the future, because we see medicine and science as a history of continuous improvement and getting better. So underlying this idea of progress, or the teleological idea, underlying this idea of advancement and progress, is that there is a sort of innate or metaphysical force which is pushing history and pushing humans to be smarter and better. But this metaphysical force has never been clearly defined. And when you think about that, it is itself a kind of religious understanding of the world, that you can't point to where this force lives. It doesn't live down the road at my neighbour's house or whatever. So what is this force that's implicitly pushing human history? It has yet to be defined. So that's one idea of cultural change. The other idea of cultural change I want to look at is culture contact. The famous anthropological example of this is Franz Boas. He was looking at the Kwakwa, or the Kwakiutl culture of sort of southern area of Vancouver Island and adjacent areas on the mainland. Now, he called it the Kwakiutl, so I'll use that terminology. The Kwakiutl have patrilineal and matrilineal elements in their culture. There's descent from the father. For example, in my society, my name is Nicholas Herriman. My father's name was Michael Herriman. His father's name was Lawrence Raymond Herriman. So the Herriman is patrilineal. It goes down the father's line. Other things in modern Australia go down the mother's line. For example, Jewish people identify with being Jewish if their mother was a Jew and their mother's mother was Jew. So that's matrilineal. Now, amongst the Kwakiutl, Boas noted that there were a lot of patrilineal elements to the culture. Inheritance, for example, you get your father's goods, or whatever it was. But he also noted that there were some matrilineal elements, like the tribes to the north in Vancouver Island. So on that basis, he hypothesized that there had been culture contact with the tribes to the north, influencing the Kwakiutl in the south. Now, the general idea I got from when I was an undergrad, reading books about anthropology, was that Boas and diffusionism were completely wrong. But we see evidence of diffusionism everywhere. I mean, archaeologists, for example, working in the Fertile Crescent, That's an area of the Middle East sort of which spans in the east from Baghdad all the way over to like the area of Palestine and Jordan to the west. And this is one of the areas where widespread agriculture first took off, or horticulture, gardening that is. And there's pretty clear evidence that it spreads from one area to the next over generations. So their culture contact seems to be the model. One farmer sees another farmer farming. Sorry, one person who doesn't farm sees another farmer farming, copies him, and so on. In my own background, being a teenager, living in Perth in the pre-internet era, Perth's an isolated city in Western Australia, it was very clear to me, like we were into things like rap music and then thrash music, and the culture, and really it was only through culture contact with America when bands would come and visit Perth, or when when we would hear hits on the radio, or see fanzines, magazines for fans, as they used to be called. So clearly, like if you looked at thrash music and hip-hop music, in the 1980s in Perth, you would see an example of culture contact. Now, the academic word for culture contact is diffusionism. The idea is that the practices and ideas diffuse from one culture to another. So hip-hop music diffused from New York City, across America, and then over to other parts of the world, including Perth. Alright, so there are two ideas of cultural and social change, or historical change, in human societies. One is the model of teleology, of advancement, the triumphant march of progress. The other is of diffusionism. There are two ideas that are predominated in anthropology. Now the next question is, what makes cultures change? Now I talked before that there's this, for the teleological models, for all those teleological models, there's an idea of an underlying or innate invisible force which is pushing human culture. And what is it pushing, or what is the basis for this change? We have materialist positions. Materialist positions say that what is important, or what is significant in historical change, is matter. That means technologies, such as whether you're using stones, bronze implements, steel implements, whether you're farming or herding, whether you have large-scale irrigation or gardens, whether you own factories and plantations and mines. That's the idea of technology. And the question is, what kinds of technologies do you have, and who owns these technologies? And these are the things that will drive history. If you combine it with class conflict. So for example, if we look before Marx's dialectic and class conflict, if we looked at the last stage, which we are still living in now, which is the bourgeoisie owning the means of production, which is like factories and, I don't know, telecommunications companies, mining companies, and we have the proletariat, the working class. The bourgeoisie owns these means of production, we, the working class, work in them, and that relationship to material, the mines, who owns the mines and what they do with them, defines class, and the conflict between the class will drive history. So it's really a question of matter, who owns it. A less academic position was made popular about 20 years ago by a guy called Jared Diamond in a book which was, I think, called Guns, Germs and Steel. Maybe there was another one, but basically he said that guns, germs, steel were the drivers of historical change and accounted for why some countries like the US were wealthy and some countries like Papua New Guinea were poorer. So that's the materialist position on why cultures and societies change. The other position is called the idealist position. There's never been a radical idealist thinker, like Marx was a radical materialist. The closest we have is a guy called Weber. Max Weber, one of the other founders of sociology. He's one of the big figures of sociology would be Marx, who I just mentioned, Weber, Durkheim and Tönnies, I guess, would be the four biggest thinkers in the early stages of the discipline. So we've looked at Marx, now we'll look at Weber's position. He famously wrote a book, one of my favourite books, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And what he argued was that what ushered in capitalism in Europe was a new way of living and a new way of thinking. Not so much, we'll put it another way, a new way of thinking and a new way of living was just as significant as relationships to matter, who owns what and who works on what. In other words, what you think is what drives history. Specifically, he argued that a new ethic where you, instead of working to live, you started to live to work. Work became a form of salvation, a form of, and wealth, the wealth you obtained from work was a sign of God's grace. So Weber did perceive an increasing rationalisation and bureaucratisation of the world, more generally, but I don't think he didn't write about it as if it was an inevitable force in history, which we get with the teleological schools of the triumphant march of progress. So in summary, I've looked at four ideas. The picture is in no way complete, but that's the basic picture we have. To repeat, the basic picture we have for cultural and social change, the basic picture we have for the history of human cultures and societies is not complete. We have an idea, one model we have is teleology, that societies and cultures improve and get better, get more complicated, get wealthier, these kinds of things. And that is being critiqued from within anthropology itself. Another idea is that societies change because they come into contact with other societies. This is the idea of culture contact or diffusionism. This idea is also widely disregarded by anthropologists. And those 1 and 2, diffusion and teleology, describe the form of historical change. The why of historical change, there's two schools. One is the materialist school, that what drives cultural and social change is relationship to means of production. Who owns what kind of technologies are used, and conflicts that emerge out of that. That's sort of like in the Marxist model of dialectic. There's also idealism, which is the idea that what really matters is not matter so much as ideas in people's heads. Now these are the basic ideas, and they're not neat, nor are they complementary. So you could say this is a crucial question which hasn't been dealt with properly. There are more advanced ideas about change which pop up within different disciplines. So I've come across some of these passively. One of my favourite one is Thomas Kuhn's idea of scientific revolutions, and he talks about scientific revolutions such as, for example, the idea that the heliocentric universe, the idea that the sun was at the centre of the universe, or the idea coming from Darwin that evolution explained the different species that live on the planet at the moment. Now, Thomas Kuhn sees scientific revolutions not as advances, but rather as cyclical, that they never really go anywhere. There's just a new set of, he said, what happens is there's a new way of doing science that emerges. Everybody gets on board and writes textbooks and agrees. Then problems emerge. then a radical thinker critiques it and cuts it down and establishes a new one, like Newton or Einstein. Then everybody gets on board with that, then textbooks emerge, and everybody agrees with it, then problems emerge, and then a new thinker comes along and critiques it, and so on. So you never really get anywhere with Kuhn. So rather than the lineal models we saw with the teleological idea of history, it's a cyclical model. An interesting thing I came across recently from political science is the idea of path dependency in critical junctures. So this is a bit different, but let's say if you look at the French Revolution, you have an aristocracy, monarchy supporting an aristocracy, and these are institutions. And what happens is that at certain critical junctures, these institutions get let's say, dismantled, and new institutions emerge based on the ideas of people around, such as liberty, equality and fraternity, and you have the French Revolution, and now new institutions emerge like a parliament and so on. So that's the idea of path dependency in critical junctures. A famous example, widely discredited too, is from Bateson, an anthropologist from the 1930s, 20s and 30s. We talked about schismogenesis, that certain societies had a tendency to, let's say, break apart and come back together, whereas other societies had a kind of steady state. So there was societies that broke up, come together, broke up, come together, let's have a steady state. These are more advanced ideas. I don't think they get us further with the critical, crucial idea or critical, crucial question of how societies and culture change. So to finally sum up, there are advanced ideas about cultural and historical change. The basic ideas, however, remain diffusionism, teleology, and what's supposed to be the drivers of these changes can be materialist or idealist drivers or causes. Thank you.